You were just discussing the impact of the Mongols on the Crusades. Um, we can see it in a few ways. We do have in the 13th century, so that's kind of where we've linked up with time-wise. There were Nestorian Mongol ambassadors sent to Louis IX of France when he was in Cyprus, preparing to go on crusade, and they went there with the hope of using the crusade for Mongol expansion against the Muslims, who were, as we know, in between the Western Christians and the Mongol Empire. But the Mongol Empire started to break up around the year 1260. And this was leading to more interest from the Mongol perspective in having a relationship with the West. There was also the rise, as we're going to learn next week, of a new Islamic power, the Mamluks in Egypt, who were a threat to the Mongols, or they perceived them to be. So in 1262, it was suggested that there was a two-pronged attack on the Mamluks that would allow the Christians to take back Jerusalem. And so there's several letters going back and forth that suggest such things, but they never really come to anything. And of course, it definitely didn't come to anything when the leader of the Mongols converted to Islam. It definitely wasn't in his best interest then. The Mongols displaced lots of people too. And this had an impact on the Crusades, because they were the displaced people, that is, were moving into Syria and areas that had been under Crusader control. We have Kit Boghat taking Aleppo and Damascus, and then he sent a messenger to Cairo to demand Egyptian submission. So when we read the works like the Crusades through Arab eyes, it makes a point that from the Islamic perspective too, there was the fear that the Western Christians and the Mongols might link up. It wasn't just fanciful thinking on the Westerners' part. But in 1260, the Mamluks defeated the Mongols, and took Syria back. Up until that point, nobody had really been effectively pushing the Mongols back. And this means that Egypt takes center stage in the Muslim world, which is going to be important for us next week. It allows Baybars to become Sultan of Egypt and allowed for a powerful Muslim world to rise again. So this is going to be background to us next week. When we talk about biological and technological exchange throughout this Eurasian area, when we think biology, we immediately think the Black Death. But there were others. I'm not going to spend too much time in this video talking about the Black Death, even though it's one of my favourite topics, because there's a good GIS-based activity for you to do after this video, and it emphasises the role of trade routes in spreading the Black Death. So it ties in really nicely with last week's theme, this week's theme of trade being a great unifier and breaking down borders, but also it brings bad things in the form of bubonic plague. So this happens in the 1340s from Western European perspective. We call it the Black Death. Really, it is bubonic plague, or as more recent research indicates, a pneumonic plague, that people were spreading it, not the little fleas on the poor ratties. People in the time, though, called it things like the Great Mortality or the Pestilence. And it raged in Western Europe from 1346 to 1353. We have huge leaps forward in our knowledge of Yersinia pestis. That's the bacteria that causes bubonic plague. Most recently, it's been found that it is related to earlier breakouts, like Justinian's plague at the end of the 6th century, and okay, there's an earlier one anyway. Nope, mine's gone blank. It'll come to me. It mutates. It's related to them, but it actually mutates. We're not sure, maybe 100 years or so before the big Black Death outbreak. It is the same DNA than the versions that still survive today. And yes, it still survives today. And if you really want to be icked out, you can go and Google that. We've managed to get this because we've managed to extract ancient DNA from victims' teeth and then do genetic comparisons of the bacteria. So when we read medieval sources, they talk about the characteristics a lot, and the main thing they talk about is what gives the disease its name, buboes, hence the bubonic, which is what these pictures show, that it causes big swellings. Here in all these pictures are pointing to the groin, but also in the armpits, in the neck, and that's because that's where the lymph nodes are. So it's showing that the lymph nodes are filled with pus. Basically, the immune system has been totally compromised. It is been overwhelmed by the disease. Recent research indicates, though, that actually it's a different strain called pneumonic plague that caused the Black Death, whereby people were spreading it from their lungs. And that explains why we think it could have had an 80% mortality rate, the Black Death. So puts COVID-19 in perspective, at least. Then there's a third type called septicemic, which is still kind of the mystery one. We're really not sure how septicemic work, except that, as the name implies, like, it's into your bloodstream and it kills you really, really, really quickly in a matter of hours only. The Silk Road comes into it when we look at the spread of the Black Death. So this is not an ideal map here, but it's the best one that I've ever come across. And it also, as it says here, it's Afro-Eurasia, which is really helpful because most maps concentrate on Europe. But the important thing to stress is that the Black Death was throughout the medieval world, the medieval known world. It was on 3 continents. As these dates show, there's outbreaks in India, modern day Bangladesh, in the 1320s, and we're not sure how that's related. So that's why they kind of got like a bit of grey and then an arrow leading northwards into China. This Chinese outbreak, though, is the same one that ultimately crosses the Eurasian steppes and hits not just Western Europe, but the Islamic world as well. And that gap, you can see here, there's grey on the left and grey on the right, and then there's just an arrow that splits into 2 in the middle. That's because we don't really understand yet the movement across this area, because it moves very, very quickly across this vast area. And yes, of course, the theory is, and it does hold pretty well, that it's the Silk Road that expedites it, that the rats, it's not the rats, it's the fleas are traveling on the camels, because camels are effective vectors. Pretty much anything can be a vector and a host for bubonic plague. So it was traveling on the caravans across the Silk Road. But even, so that is a possibility. However, the pneumonic that it is spread through pneumonic strains explains the rapidity with which it crossed the Silk Road. Because if it was just the fleas and just the rats, they've done studies and find that, you know, it takes a long time for plague to move any distance by rats and fleas alone. Because it arrived, it's endemic in certain parts of the US, like Colorado and Idaho, up in the prairie dog populations, up in the Rockies. But it didn't arrive in the US at all until like about 1900. So I think it took like a couple of generations, and human generations, not rat generations, to get into the prairie dog population. So it is not, the bubonic form is not fast spreading. So we're still doing more research onto this, but it's cool. It does show how history can work really beneficially with the hard sciences to help us understand more about the past and also the present. Another area where they're doing more work is the spread in Africa. As you can see in this map, the whole of North Africa, the North African coast and parts of Arabia are marked in grey. And obviously we know why that is, because that's where the Islamic world is. And we know by the 14th century, Mamluk Egypt is very much in power. In fact, McNeill, one of the writers about the Black Death, a lot of his theories are outdated now with the new scientific research. He tries to explain the perseverance of the Black Death in Egypt because of Mamluk centrality. That their advanced political system, linking people, helped the spread of it in the Islamic world. What we're not sure of is, did it cross the Sahara and make it into sub-Saharan Africa? That is, again, an area we're not too sure about. We think it might have, but stay tuned. I think we'll find out more about these transmission processes in maybe the next 5 years or so. So I'm going to stop there with the Black Death, and instead you should go and look at the interactive map, which links it into trade routes, and so ties it back to this week's theme a lot better. Okay, so another thing that we get from the east to the west is technology, technological knowledge. Bearing in mind, the west is almost exclusively rural. Their elites pretty much refuse to do anything hard. We've talked about the psyche of the Crusaders a lot. Yeah, they really don't want to farm. They want to go off and be, get remission of their sins and be glorious in the Holy Lands. So this has led a lot of scholars to be like, look, the technological advances came from the peasantry because the lords really don't care about that kind of thing. Merchants also, that's why I tied in today, that merchants are vehicles of innovation, and it's through merchant networks that a lot of knowledge spreads. We can see this in particular through cloth manufacture and also the knowledge of the printing press. Our lords, though, they do want to make as much money as possible, and their income is derived from the land, after all. We don't have the engineer, the inventor, the person whose job it is to create tangible, physical, what's the word I'm looking for? Innovative, technological and technical improvements. That is a position that does not evolve until like the mid-15th century. But in saying that, it's not to say that people didn't have specialist knowledge. There just wasn't this like profession of the engineer. Instead, it was up to the guilds a lot of the time to implement new construction techniques, building techniques, etc. So if we look at the technological achievements that can be attributed to cultural exchange, it's pretty hard actually, because there's no way to limit the spread of ideas in the Middle Ages. Today, we have, if you have an invention, you patent it to make sure that nobody rips you off. None of this exists in the Middle Ages. Even the guilds try to contain their knowledge within their guild and not let it spread to rival guilds, but they can't do that. Venice is the first place to create the patent law, and that was in 1447. In 1447, Venice created a 10-year monopoly for new inventions. The idea is that the invention was not hidden, and so everybody would benefit from it. That is because it's been suggested that if people think their ideas are going to be stolen, they're not going to act on it. But even then, Venice's early patent laws were not that successful. 1447 is right at the end of the time period we're interested in. A lot of historians do attribute the boom in technological developments in the later Middle Ages with a increased contact with the outside. So economy and technology are thus interlinked. One way that we might be able to see this technological contact in the world coming from the spinning wheel. It was known in the East for centuries before it appeared in Europe. It didn't appear in Europe until the late 11th century. That is because the Muslims copied the technology from India and China and then spread it to Europe, probably through Spain and Sicily, which we know are contact zones in Western Europe. We also think that the horizontal loom was learned from the Muslims, who in turn may have borrowed it from further east. The horizontal loom doesn't sound like a big deal, but the horizontal loom is for weaving textiles. Prior to the horizontal loom, it was the vertical loom, and therefore you could only have a length of cloth as tall as the person weaving it. Horizontal, you can walk up and down, and you can have much bigger, more complex pieces of cloth. Windmills, we know, were in Iran by the 9th century. They had reached Christian Spain by the 10th century, and they were made more efficient in the West before they get particularly associated with the Dutch. An interesting one is the blast furnace, which is needed for metal production. Because if you're creating steel, the purest steel comes when you heat up the metal ore enough to run the impurities off. The more impurities that you've got in the metal, the weaker it is, but the impurities will burn off at different temperatures. So you need to get it to as high a temperature as possible to get most of the impurities out. And the way that they did that in the Middle Ages were through furnaces, and the blast furnace is the furnace technology that allows medieval people to heat up the metal to the highest possible temperature. This is a question mark because the technology is known in China. Obviously, there's a lot of movement between China and, the likes of Venice. And there's a lot of movement, China to the Muslim world, to the western parts of the Muslim world. But the first place it pops up is in Sweden. And this is why there's a question mark, because there's really not that much contact between Sweden and the Muslim world or Sweden and China. So it might actually be an example of independent invention. You can read more about these technological innovations in your Millward textbook. Warfare is another technology that has been discussed a lot in terms of cultural exchange between East and West, and between the Islamic world in the middle too. So a lot of people have tried to identify what forms of warfare the Crusaders learned from encountering the East and the Muslim world in the Crusader states. It's been argued that the siege towers, which are not pictured here in the previous one, no, not really. But they're just the towers that, like, wood that you roll up to the side of whatever you're attacking. They were used by both Muslims and Crusaders during the Crusades, but probably not that often, because remember, the landscape of the Holy Lands and a lot of the Islamic world and the Eurasian steppes as well. Good building timber is scarce. I mean, it's a period of deforestation even in Western Europe, but even less timber available in the East. We have accounts of Crusaders arriving in the Crusades and to build their siege weaponry, taking apart the boats that they arrived in for the timber that they needed. Other catapult innovations of the Middle Ages, like the trebuchet, which is the counterweight catapult, and the mangonel is the torsion catapult. It's very difficult to tell when the transition between these two forms took place. Armor also, we had chainmail, like these guys are caught in this manuscript image on the left. It's heavy but more movable than plate. Muslims had this as well. They called it the zardiya. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Another thing that did come out of the around the time of the Crusades, was the surcoat. So that's the covering over your armor with distinguishing marks. That's developed in the early 12th century, and it's kind of amazing that it wasn't around before then, because otherwise, how do you tell whose side people are on? Crossbow was unknown to the Byzantines before the First Crusade. We know that they didn't know the crossbow because Anna Komnene writes about how appalled she was when the Crusaders rock up with it. She uses it as another excuse for their barbarity. So in the crossbow, we can see how technology can go from west to east as well. So it's very hard to distinguish Crusader tactics and what the Muslims had from one another, because the things that they have are actually pretty similar. Both have lances, for example. Now, the swords are pretty similar. The curved sword that we immediately think about, thanks to the movies with Muslim armies, that's actually a later development. So the Crusaders already encountered the Islamic world and were resident in the Holy Lands before that technology developed. As you can see from this picture on the right, though, Muslim archers tended to be mounted, whereas if we look in the picture on the left, our Crusaders are on foot. Knights tend not to be mounted archers. Um, the evidence is pretty slight. It's talked up more. Historians like Lynn White Jr., he's a really big name, they can merely, inquire, did Westerners learn anything from the Near East about methods of war during the Crusades? He says the only reasonably clear case is the petroleum-based liquid known as Greek fire, which at that time could have been borrowed from either the Byzantines or the Muslims. Chicken and egg situation. Greek fire came from bronze. Excuse me, I thought there was another slide of it there. Let's go back. It came from bronze tubes, which inspired the cannon. And of course, we know that gunpowder was an invention of the East that made its way west. In the earlier stages of the Crusades, the Westerners seem to have had superior technology in hand arms, and this might account for their success to some degree. But then the Muslims learned to fight this way too. It's unclear who had these siege engines. We know the Crusaders, as I said, they're dismantling their boats to build them. But the Muslim sources call them Frankish, which implies that the Crusaders had the knowledge first, even though they don't use them in the West until much later. Again, all very confusing. We also need to bear in mind that the population of this part of the world is very diverse. It's not just a simple case of Muslim versus West versus East, because we've got the Byzantines. We also are ignoring the fact that there's already Christian populations there, and I don't mean the Nestorians, I mean the Armenians. So identifying technological exchange in precise terms between East and West via the Muslim world is very difficult to do, in other words. We can say in broad terms that knowledge was exchanged and that the Silk Roads were, brought both positive developments and negative developments, but it's very hard to be very precise beyond that point. Okay then, so you need to go and learn more about the trade routes and how this spread disease, and then you can go and take it over to your flip grid, just the one to discuss this week. If I can figure out how to stop